go.
And good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Good morning.
Good to see you all. I'll just change out my name here. Okay. All righty. So thank you. All right. Okay, so this morning, my goal is to wrap up the this final chapter 4. That will make the reading slightly longer than normal, but I couldn't find a natural way to break it and still carry it through another week. So I thought it would be best to wrap it up. We've perhaps been spending enough time with demons and time to move on to other topics. So if you'll permit me, I'll call up the screen. So Benum Christen, and I greet Christ in you and welcome you back this morning. Let's see. Here we are. Okay, so let us pray. There are 1,000 things, O God, I could do wrong. Let me discern the one that is right. There are a million choices to be made. Help me to know which will give life. And where there is but nothing for me to do, nor choices I might make, let me know the power of the present and of simply being here. Amen. So our first reading will span pages 133 to 134 here in the final paragraphs of the 4th chapter, for those of you who'd like to follow in the book. To keep vigil is to hold out a tenacious refusal to medicate, distract, or isolate oneself from the world's suffering. It is to accept the influence of our own demons and our capacity to contribute to the world's darkness, if not by action, then too often by omission. If we limit our contemplation to the good and uplifting, to the sublime and transcendent, our faith will become dishonest and inauthentic. We cannot be people of the resurrection while still denying the cross. We cannot be Easter people if we have not witnessed Good Friday. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul proclaimed, "May I never boast of anything except the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by which the world has been crucified to me and I to the world." To boast in our weakness in the midst of suffering is not to sink into nihilism, but to embody a uniquely Christian optimism that insists on the light of the resurrection, even while standing in the shadow of the cross. It is this same optimism that echoes in the heart of the contemplative who forgives the world's darkness, if only to prove that faith, not fate, love, not hate, life, not death, have the final say. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Indeed, we are to become in Christ the very light that darkness cannot overcome, and the embodiment of hope that makes a mockery of despair. To be crucified to the world through the ascesis of vigil keeping is to participate in the frailty of Christ, by which we come to know the inner anguish of the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? It is to allow this question to become our own and to hang midair, as it were, vulnerable and naked, with no foothold or grounding, and to remain faithful, literally full of faith, knowing now, as Christ did then, no response will ever come. None, that is, except in Christ himself, through whose resurrection we are given not a decisive answer, but a new and definitive question. Who do you say that I am? Christ, we discover, is not the answer, but the question. In response, each of us must take up again the mantle of our contemplative vocation to crucify ourselves to the world, or, as Paul would encourage, boast in your weakness, so that the power of Christ may dwell in you. And let us pray. So our concluding paragraphs continue on 134 through 35, the closing paragraphs of chapter 4. To keep vigil, then, is above all to stay awake, to keep watch with Christ in the Gethsemane of history, where so many innocents have been arrested, held prisoner, and executed for the cause of righteousness. No less in our own day, we are confronted with an almost unbearable weight of grief and bewilderment in the face of barbaric violence, acts of terrorism, mass shootings, endless warfare, refugee crises, and environmental destruction. With each new headline, a dread sense of familiarity is ushered in. We've been here before. We've heard the talking heads and the politicizing, the accusations and the judgment, and the questions for which there will never be answers. The temptation to seek distraction in blame and argument, anger and judgment, mundane diversion or avoidance, is the temptation to fall asleep. What we really desire in all of these is to hide behind our anonymity, to keep the world at arm's length and the suffering of others impersonal. Yet each of us bears a moral and spiritual obligation neither to edit the world's ugliness nor to remain complicit in its presence. Solidarity with those who suffer is impossible without the deeply personal act of vigil keeping, whereby we consciously remain present to the experience of another. Who is to benefit if we are crucified to the world in an abstract or impersonal way? It is your heart that must be allowed to break with the hearts of mothers and fathers, spouses and siblings in whose loved ones Christ has been crucified yet again through some new persecution or act of violence. And that is why vigil keeping is perhaps the most rigorous ascetical practice the contemplative life will demand of you. With Macarius, it is you who must gather every human being into your very heart without distinguishing the bad and good. It is you who must refrain from the duality of judgment and accusation, so to enfold both victim and perpetrator in the tender mercy of God. And with relentless compassion, it is you who must hold this contemplative gaze with weeping and tears and dread. And as you do, reveal to all whom you encounter that the world is beautiful still, because you make it so, because your love makes it so. Amen. All right. So as always, I open us then to any conversation we might want to engage based on your own sort of thoughts or reflections on the reading itself today. So as always, you have the floor. Morning, Nicola. Go right ahead.
So this is just a question. It was the piece where it said, Christ is the answer, not the question, or perhaps it was the other way around because I immediately flipped it and got confused. So it wasn't in this last reading, this last set of paragraphs that you just read, it was the one that preceded that. Could you explain that? Christ is the answer, question?
Yeah, I think we're all familiar with the bumper stickers that say Christ is the answer. And in many ways, I was trying to offer a different take on that Christ is the question, and the answer is how we respond to that question. So we become the answer in our vocation, and our discipleship becomes the answer to Christ's call. So I'm in some ways reacting is too strong a way, but responding to the sort of general assumption among many Christians that Christ is the answer. And I think there's something valuable in reversing that and asking, or in making the statement that Christ, in fact, is the question. Christ poses the question, who do you say that I am, for example? And it becomes our response, a lifelong response to that question mark, that open-endedness as to how each of us will answer that question, that there isn't one pat answer, right? But that each of us embodies an answer to that call of Christ, who is questioning all of us, who is in a sense knocking on the door of our hearts, and to which there is in that an implicit demand for a response on some level. So I'm trying to reverse it and say we're the answer to Christ, who is the question calling us. Does that make sense, Nicola? Yeah. Okay. And that's why I reversed it. Yeah. All right. Let's see, Carol, go right ahead.
Okay, so I love that. That's, that writing was so beautiful. But but what I really responded to was the part that really helped me about how God didn't answer Christ on the cross, and that God doesn't answer our questions, like why did he allow the Jews to be slaughtered in the Holocaust, or why is Ukraine happening? Why did our ancestors, do, slavery? Why were we complicit in racism? All the questions, but you're right. God did speak, and does speak through us and each other. And, but, with my past, I always get the thing about listen to what God is saying. And of course, that's a hard thing for me because I don't hear anything. I sense God's movement in the world. But anyway, so I appreciated, I'm going to remember that God did not respond to Jesus on the cross when he was in pain, the worst pain of ever. So.
Yeah, not only physical, but sort of the anguish of thinking, well, why have you forsaken me? Like all of this effort I put into this, and where are you now that like it's all crashing down around me? I think, I've realized in my own life that providence is often best seen through the rearview mirror, in that sense that we really can't always in the moment see the potential goodness of what appears to us, right, to be a failure or a disaster or something that didn't quite, for those of you who might know, I've been preparing for 2.5 years for our first sort of inaugural residence to start our pilot program here, which was supposed to start on Thursday. And within 24 hours, two major crises within the families of two of them just required them to withdraw, which essentially put a kibosh on the whole program. Fernando had COVID. I was afraid of passing it on to them and having my residence here and having to withdraw from the program myself, which would have been somewhat disastrous. So it seemed like all of these things. So there's this sense of like, wow, 2.5 years. And if we'd only done this a week earlier, it would have just flown by and all of these issues would have come up after the fact, right? So but for 1 week, the whole thing sort of crashed and burned. But that isn't entirely true either. There's been a sense in which as much as there was this sort of implicit disappointment, there was also this sense of, it feels like it just has to be this way right now. And I don't know why, but a few of what I call my remnant residents have said, you know what, we're coming anyway, even though there's no programming, and they're here now. And I who knows what this week will bring. So I'm just trying to have that more vigilant posture of letting go of 2.5 years of work and knowing that this is somehow beyond me. And it will unfold as it unfolds. And I will be able to look back and say, aha, look at that. So this is a very minor sort of thing in the world affairs of all the things that you've named, but it becomes within our own life, what Merton talks about, abandoning to the present moment, just abandoning to what is. And and then to see what unfolds from that. And I don't have an answer. Like, really, why did this have to happen? That was a lot of work. But here we are. And so whatever that means, it's much bigger than whatever I thought it might be.
So do you think God is doing something? Let me get back to the puppet thing again. Do you think God is doing something, or God is so infused in all of us that it's always moving towards the good?
Yes, the latter.
Okay,
I don't think God caused tragedies in the family of my residents, 2 families, in order to prove a point to me. you can hear the self-centeredness around that kind of assumption, right? So no, I just think this is the way life happens. But just the way God didn't crucify Jesus, right? That's the way the world responded to his message, to the threat that he posed, and so forth. But in the midst of what happens, there is that deep infusion of a God who then who abides throughout, and in the end brings all things to that place of resurrection. Ultimately, yeah, that would be my take. Thanks, Carol. Hi there, Richard.
Good morning. Good morning, all. Father Vincent, would you kindly put up the second reading, the portion about anger and judgment and blame?
Sure. There we go. Let's see. Is it right here?
It's no, above that, please. About blame and judgment.
Here we go.
The temptation is to seek distraction in blame and argument, anger and judgment. I think you're saying there that when I engage in blame, argument, judgment, and anger, that I have fallen asleep, that right. I can return and see with a clean heart.
Right.
Oh, well, such beautiful writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think that the temptation to do all those things, to blame and, to vent, when we think about, Uvalde as a recent tragedy that I still struggle to try to incorporate somehow in the myriad of things that we're confronting in the world. There is that temptation in me to blame and to judge. I mean, we're seeing what's coming out about how poorly this seems to have been handled. And, there is a certain rightful anger around that when one understands the consequences of the tragedy. And yet all of that, what Macarius talked about, and this comes from the readings a week ago, but if you see it in the book, you'll see it's much more sort of cohesive. It holds together because it's closer. But he really says, what it means to be filled with the Spirit is to draw to no longer distinguish the good from the bad, and to just show it's all becomes about mercy, mercy, mercy. And that's, I think, the understandable temptation to demand justice and to point fingers and to rage against the evil ultimately becomes an avoidance of just being present to the horror of the moment. Right. And there's something, frankly, that I think is satiating or satisfying when we judge and blame and rant. When we're confronted with that, it feels good to kind of get it off your chest. But I think Macarius is calling us to something much deeper there.
We're playing God, perhaps, when we
make
that, and I guess judgment is for the Lord.
Yeah.
And even when I, for instance, mundane diversion, watch television instead of being awake to all that is occurring, it's a falling asleep.
Right. So how do we create that kind of balance in our lives where we understand the intensity of the contemplative life, which is really to remain vigilant and present, and to understand that part of what it means to be a Christian is to continue to understand life as joy and celebration and beauty, and not to become so rigid and incapable of seeing that because of the things we're confronting. So where does enjoyment and pleasure and joy in life be able to come from that constant vigilance, rather than those things become a distraction from the vigilance?
I see I have to give up self-blame also. Thank you for that
Yeah,
clarity.
that's right, Richard. Wonderful. Hi there, Marianne. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. It's been a while since I've been able to join you, so I'm not sure which book this is coming from. But I've got a statement and a question.
Sure.
If you could feel. So much thankful for this insight and the invitation here. I started working 6 months ago as a hospice chaplain, and I find the challenge in keeping vigil. Like, I come home sometimes with, a great deal in my heart and carrying my patients' sadness and their families, and I'm struggling. Struggling sometimes. When I hit, I'm exhausted and hit the pillow, and then my mind is trying to process. And I realize what more and more I need more and more contemplative sitting. I need to sit in the quiet for God to process that through my heart. And that's a keeping vigil.
Mm-hmm.
And in reference to like what the last gentleman said about anger, and I've realized we have to sit. I can't ignore any of the emotions inside. I can't ignore any of my sadness, and my anger, because underneath that anger, when I sit with that anger, then I can truly be with what's in my heart and what's underneath that anger and the sadness. And sometimes, to bring our tears into God's presence and into our contemplative prayer is what I'm hearing. And it's important, and I'm in it right now.
Sure. Thank you, Marianne. Yeah, I so appreciate your opening about that. A couple months back, I was invited to speak to a small group of folks, who are in medical care and who are dealing with what we call vicarious or trauma around COVID and what it meant to be on the front lines of that crisis when you had to make very hard decisions and see the kind of suffering you're talking about, people dying and family members having to say goodbye on Zoom. And I mean, all these horrific things that we've heard about. And to be honest, when I first was, preparing to speak with them, because I was dealing with a very educated, cerebral group of people who I figured, were going to kind of be like tough nuts to crack to get through that, to really help them process. It wasn't 5 minutes before they just immediately opened up. And I realized how much they were willing and eager and needed to have these conversations around what it's been like and the trauma they've been coping with and may well still have to cope with around the kinds of situations you find yourself in, life and death, right? And the sadness and that. So I was very moved by their willingness to get past their sort of cerebral medical kind of way in which they're required to function and to really speak heart to heart with one another and with myself on that. And it was very moving to me, but I hear that same kind of struggle in what you're sharing right now, and it is real. And you're right to say, the last thing I think someone in your position is being asked to do is to be less human in order to be present. In other words, to try to disintegrate your mind and heart. The thing is, how do you both remain fully present, mind and heart? And that does mean the kinds of emotions that are welling up, the kinds of tenderness and vulnerability and processing that you acknowledge you have to do. Because the truth be told, I think if you don't do that integration, if you don't work on your capacity to be present fully and not just to cut off your emotions because it's too hard, you will be far less capable of offering what those folks need in the moment, which is a human being and not just a decision maker, right? And that, to your credit, the pain that brings out and the tenderness and just really even the poignancy and beauty and the fragility of life and all those sort of bittersweet emotions that arise in the kinds of hospice situations you might be facing. It's a beautiful thing for you to be able to be emotionally present. And there's a difference between a kind of emotional presence that is compassionate versus one that makes it about me, right? And you know what I'm talking about. So I think it's perfectly appropriate that you remain human, not only after the fact as you process, but because of that meditation and contemplative processing, giving yourself a capacity to be really tender and present to all of that in your own fullness, if you want to say.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very true. And the more, I mean, I just feel, yeah, I've had to cut out other activities in my life, really become more introverted. So I have this time to process. And the more that I do, the more I feel like I am able to be there in tenderness and that vulnerability. And I feel like that kind of like the presence is more effective. I can see the connections happening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And allow that also, in the big picture of when we're dealing on the sort of the precipice between, life and death on a regular basis, sort of that veil that you're accompanying people to, if you want to say, to also let that open in you, the beauty of life, your own life and the relationships. I mean, we're all going to be there at some point. This is what the ancient monks, called Memento Mori, the meditation or the contemplation on one's own death, and the recognition, not in a morbid, somber sort of way, but in a way that makes me say, wow, this doesn't last forever. And what a beautiful day and a beautiful moment in this fragile, brief existence. And to allow that to cultivate also not just a morbidity around, oh God, we're all going to end up there, but what a gift we have in this. And that whatever death brings in that transition to whatever we call next, that this remains nonetheless a beautiful, brief, and magical reality for each of us, and to allow that to open you to all that and enjoy your life. Yeah, you won't take it for granted that way.
Thank you. Yes.
Indeed. Thanks, Maria. Good morning, David.
You say with Macarius, it is you who must gather every human being into your very heart without distinguishing the bad and the good. It seems like that's radical Christianity at its best.
Right.
And it echoes the words of Jesus when he said, when I'm lifted up on the cross, I will draw all to me. The Greek word is pantos, which is comprehensive, all as it can be. And so there's a very convicting words. It's a very convicting phrase, but it also seems to me a real echo of the heart of Christ in the way that's Macarius speaks it there.
Absolutely. I mean, he is doing what I think in the best iteration of sainthood, ones who magnify Christ in the world. I mean, he's doing that beautifully. He is precisely magnifying that radicalism of that. In Greek, the way you decline that all, pas pan, that pan meaning all, or all could be interpreted all things, where we get words like Pan-American, right, or something like that, pan-cosmic. So it means that all encompassing. And so that is where, even what, he's magnifying also Christ's own teaching on love, which is to love indiscriminately, right? To bless those who curse you and to pray for those who persecute you. I mean, it really is a radical call to non-judgment and to radical presence, which requires not just faith or even hope, but trust. There is an element of trusting the divine in the midst of a situation where I'm incapable of seeing beyond what's being presented to me now. Right? So deep trust.
Right. It's also very convicting.
Yeah.
It means that Putin has to have a place there. And it's very convicting in its comprehensiveness.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome, David. Thank you. In fact, I've just started a book some of you may be interested in. It's by Hans Urs von Balthasar, and it's called Dare We Hope, that all may be saved. And it's a theology which is exploring the teaching of universal salvation. And So far, I've only gotten 10, 15 pages into it, but it's written beautifully and simply. Dare We Hope is the name of it. Hans Urs von Balthasar. And so far quite lovely, but it seems to be a very sober-minded, accessible, opening up to the question of what do we mean when we talk about universal salvation within a Christian context. It's quite beautiful. Yeah. Yes. Hi, Christine.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm also found this little book at the library on the for sale table, and I'm reading it. It's incredible. This was written in 1973. There are 4 contributors to it: a metaphysician, an astronomer, a physicist, and a spiritual healer. And the point is, and I'm only halfway finished with it, but the point that they're making speaks to this concept of the universal Christ. And I think this is such a fantastic understanding now for us to really live into, because what they're saying, all 4 of them, from their different viewpoints, is that if we truly believe and can hold on to the reality of the fact that everything is sacred, we are sacred, and every person is sacred, and we hold that as a reality, that changes everything. It changes everything, because we are all connected to the same mind. And so if our mind is not living in the sin of the illusion that we're separate from God, then that changes how that's understood in the whole universe.
That's right. And I think, Christine, just to sort of add to that, I'm sort of I've been jotting down notes for a few months now on a sermon I'll give eventually on blessings and what blessing is. And I think what I'm trying to work out is a sense of how blessing is, what a blessing does is alters the perception of our relationship with something and establishes and acknowledge and names the sacredness of our relationship to that someone or something. So to bless, a crucifix or water or this type of thing, where saying something about the sacredness of our relationship to that and establishing some way of understanding a deeper way of connecting to that, water as cleansing or purifying and so forth. So when we say, for example, we bless the Lord, well, I remember as a kid thinking, well, God doesn't need us to bless him. What does that even mean, that we would bless God, right? It's the God who is the origin or source of blessings. But it's to, I think, acknowledge, as you're saying, that sacred relationship between all things. And as we recognize that, we start you can't help but see things differently and therefore be differently, because it's the relationship between ourselves and everything takes on a whole new level of meaning or depth or richness or intentionality. Yeah, so thank you for that. I appreciate that. Yes, hi, Roman. Good morning.
Hi,
Or
good
yes,
morning.
still morning in New York, yes.
I'm in New York for another hour.
Right.
So I'm hearing this call from Macarius to call all good and evil into our hearts. And then I'm trying to reconcile that with instances of where I read in the Bible, woe to him or woe to them who, and like a phrase like, and there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. And is that just a compassionate woe to those people, poor those people, because this is what's going to happen to them? Or is that kind of a accusation, or is it just a warning? Or how do I reconcile that woe to those?
I think it's more or less a description that for those who are asleep, to use the language that we've been sort of toying with, those who are unaware or asleep or in that sort of, that perception of illusion, it is its own suffering. So maybe that analogy some of you may have heard that may help, of the man who has a vision of hell and it's people sitting at a banquet table that goes on forever. And there's all this beautiful food, and they can't eat any of it because none of them have elbows. So they're not able to bring the food to their mouths. Have you heard this one? And then then he has a vision of heaven, and it's a banquet table that goes on forever. And people are sitting there, and none of them have elbows, but they're all eating deeply from this banquet because they're feeding each other. So the idea essentially is that in hell, we become so self-absorbed, we become so incapable of understanding that deep sacred relationship where everything gets turned in on myself that I starve before this banquet because I have no capacity to eat the food at the table. But in heaven, it's the same reality reinterpreted through a relationship. So there is no difference between heaven and hell, between the blessings and the woes, but for the suffering that we bring on ourselves for not being awake. And that is not something that, in a sense, we could say is a damning God. But there is weeping and grinding of teeth because we bring that misery on ourselves in our sleep state. That's how that would be my first inclination as to how I'd want to sort of look at this, much the way, Olivia Clement looks at that whole parable we've talked about of the sheep and goats, that they're not two kinds of people, but two aspects of every person. So when you look at it through that contemplative lens, it becomes about the suffering that is just part and parcel of our unawakened state, right? In many ways, the Buddha talks similarly about what it means to, we will suffer, we will encounter sickness, we will encounter death, we will encounter, right, old age, all of these things. And the question becomes, how do we approach those? How do we face those? Who do we become in light of those? Is that it become a source of suffering or of enlightenment and so on? I'm wondering, Roman, how that strikes you.
That strikes me well, because also I've been pondering this cryptic statement that I read recently, which is how you get there is where you end up. And I'm just wondering if I'm seeing a relationship between what you just said. And so woe to those who get there asleep or travel asleep, because that's where they end up.
Yeah, this is exactly right. So there's a sense in which how can I put it in a phrase that on the one hand, we know that Jesus is teaching and preaching out of a kind of apocalyptic framework that was part and parcel of first century Palestine, or at least many quarters of it at the time, and that his teachings on this certainly reflect that worldview. And at the same time, one can understand those teachings in ways that don't require God to be the one who is doing the punishing, causing the suffering, and so on. It's and Paul says this quite well in the beginning of his opening chapters of Romans. It's a very difficult cadence or structural way in which he organizes his opening statements, in which he's trying to suggest a kind of blanket condemnation that exists over the whole world. And he does this, seems very dark and dour, but he does this in a hyperbolic way, because the next thing he wants to say is, and that blanket has been sort of removed, that blanket, so all have been now called. So he does this to very dramatic effect. But what he says is that a lot of people will read his, what we call the Haustafeln, or the list of sins. Like we would say today, oh yeah, wine, women, and song, so you kind of list these things as sort of the vices of the day. Well, in ancient time, they had these Haustafeln, which were these sort of lists of vices, for example, that you could suggest. So he lists these vices, right? All these terrible things. But what's easy to miss in his line of argument is that he is not saying that God is punishing humanity for these sins. What he is saying is that in our freedom, God has abandoned us to those things. And that's the result of what happens when we are not giving ourselves over to God. In our free will, this is the things that start to happen, right? This is what the world becomes when we give ourselves, or when we fall asleep, or when we don't give ourselves to God. It's a very very nuanced argument. It could easily be read as these are all the sins that God is acknowledging. It's not what he's saying. He's saying when we turn away, when we are asleep, this is what becomes of society. This is the symptom of being asleep, of God saying, well, you're making your choices. There is free will, and this is what comes of it. Turn to me, and this will all sort of resolve, if you want to put it bluntly. So in a sense, when we look at the trajectory of that, we often read these texts as if God is doing the punishing, when in fact, I think in many cases, what we're seeing is this is what happens when we're asleep. This is what happens when we abandon God.
If I understand you right, it's not that we break the commandments, but we break ourselves against them.
Yes, that's a nice way of putting it.
Ships on a rock.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Roman. Nicely done. Let's see. It's a little after 8. Are there other thoughts or questions? If not, what I'll do is I will turn to see if there's anyone who took me up on my contemplative challenge for the week. So just a quick announcement. Next week, we will be looking at chapter 5, beginning chapter 5, which is Becoming Prayer. And it's the final chapter of the book. And so, as always, we'll continue to work our way through that one or two paragraphs at a time. So for those of you keeping up in the book, we begin chapter 5 next week. So let me just call up then to see if there's any thoughts on the contemplative practice. So first of all, the practice for this coming week, for those who might want to engage that, who needs your accompaniment, your witness, your vigilance, and just an invitation to be present to them in that. I think for someone like Marianne, who spoke earlier, that's not going to be a special thing you have to do, but just a more conscious way of doing what you're already doing. So I invite you into that continued practice. But that would be the suggestion. Where do you see a need for that vigil keeping with someone? Not because you can change the outcome, not because you can make things better, but because you can simply abide with someone in the midst of that. And how does that being present contemplatively assist you in that? For last week, for those who might want to have a conversation this morning, here was the challenge. Choose a day to experience unflinchingly all that life presents to you. What happens? So take a moment, a day, and just look unflinchingly, be fully present to life that day, and try to not let yourself be distracted. And what happens? And I will stop the share there. I could always rely on Kathy to come in for me. Kathy, good morning. Good to see you. Go right ahead.
I don't reliably come, but I do once in a while. This practice, as most of your practices for me, took a while to reveal what it was really asking of me. So, and I also, I think I've told you before, I put your homework in the reminders app so that daily it comes up and I look at it. But I also keep a running list of some of your previous homework. So I probably on my reminders got like the last 5 homeworks on it, because it feels like each of them has something more to reveal. Mm. So what happened, allowing a whole day just felt like way too overwhelming. But what it ended up being an invitation to is to spaciousness in each day. And so what it allowed for 3 things to come present for me to allow how I responded to transform into a different way of being with each than I have previously been in my life. And briefly, the first was I had coffee with my brother on Tuesday. And it's usually when I have coffee with him, it's kind of a mixed experience. So I look forward to it, because I love my brother. So just the joy of being with him, but also some trepidation because he's just kind of triggering as siblings can be. And so we're sitting there, he's talking, he talks a lot, he's a politician. I'm very quiet. And I start noticing judgment. I'm judging what he's saying. And this is a very common place for my mind to go to. But I notice the judgment. I don't usually notice it. I just go with it. But I noticed it. And by the noticing, my heart just opened up to this greater place that I don't usually go to, where there was this greater love surrounding both of us. And so when I left that time with him, I went away from there with a sense of love and joy, and that has stayed with me. So just such a different experience of being with my brother from that place of spaciousness. The second thing was that I have a weekly conversation with my sister next down from me. We're just 17 months apart. And I think I've said before that she living with her under her roof are two people at midpoint in dementia, her husband and one of our younger sisters. So a very challenging life for her. And she lives in a rural area, so not a whole lot of support there. So I have noticed, and my sister came to live with her in mid-May and has been there ever since. So I've noticed over the time that whereas my sisters and I our weekly conversations, it's usually a very even sharing of our joys, our sorrows, just all of life and being there for each other. What I've noticed is that a very strong call for me to just let her have the whole space because she doesn't have that much support in her life with all these demands. So my heart is kind of breaking and longing for that mutuality, but at the same time, I know I need to be there. But there's also some resentment there because, being a single person still in this now with this COVID BA5, and my white blood cell count is low, so I don't have that much contact with people. So I long for that mutuality. So there's some resentment there, and it's been growing. But again, by being in that place of spaciousness, again, it's that greater fullness of love that just surrounded us both, and that joy of just being able to be present with her in the allness.
Right.
And then the third thing is that I was just sitting here at this table where I am now, where I do everything, and I noticed, and I ruminate a lot, and I go into that place of worry, but my mind in this spaciousness caught it. And before it sunk down into this well-greased black hole. And I heard this invitation to let my creativity ask for what it is that I could be doing or thinking about, or somehow be different, to elevate and take a different path. And that's never happened before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kathy, thank you so much for all three of those examples. And I mean, obviously, the common thread is that the creation or the opening of a spaciousness, as you're calling it, that sort of a capacity for something much bigger. And you've really nailed it because, the life of meditation or contemplative practice really is largely built on observing, on noticing. Because it's all those things that are unnoticed, unobserved, unacknowledged, of which we're unaware, that continue to sustain sort of a hold on us, and we don't even realize that's happening. So how do we simply be present enough to myself in the midst of a conversation with my brother, right, or anyone that feels like there's a one-sidedness to the relationship or lack of reciprocity? How do I remain present to that? Starting with noticing his judgment, noticing your resentment, right? With, how do we begin to not allow those things to have the final say or become the way in which the narrative gets written? It's to notice and to create space, to see beyond them, to see what's bigger or deeper or broader. And that is the stuff of meditation, I think. That is the start of it, because it's in that spaciousness, that something else, which is not only a capacity for you to be present, but it's almost like when a plant overgrows its little pot and it's stifled because it needs to stretch its roots. You need a more spacious pot for something else to happen, for that stretching to happen. And our thoughts and our feelings and our emotions, when we don't acknowledge, have just the pot is too small and we're sort of choking ourselves. How do we provide a spaciousness for that? For those roots to breathe and for what is most alive in us to start to take on a new place and to give new growth. And that really is the heart and the basis and foundation of I think what we begin to do in our meditation and what our contemplative practice helps to awaken us to noticing. So good job. Yeah, A+ for class participation this week. All right. Any other thoughts that anyone would like to share then about this particular practice or anything? All right. So as I mentioned, then a week from today, I can't believe we'll be into August, which is scary. I just want you to know, because I know there's some overlap. We have had a very, very difficult time getting hold of a computer that had enough memory. There was a big supply issue, I guess, because of COVID. We were waiting about 4 months or so now for a computer that we finally received that has enough memory to be editing the videos for my Portraits of Christ, a class that I taught in the spring. So I'm going through them painstakingly now and editing out and sort of bringing them up to speed. So we'll be posting them, I hope, within the week, also with an advertisement for the fall semester. So there will be more coming up on that. So those of you who attended that, all those will be available in edited form and with their accompanying PDFs and so on, as well as an invitation to consider the fall semester. And for those of you who weren't there in the spring, you'll be able to take this one asynchronously. So I'll talk more about that probably next week, because I think I'll be a bit further along in the editing process. So until then, I bid you, as always, Benum Christinet. I greet Christ in you, and I pray you have a beautiful, awakened week ahead, where you can be fully present to the world, both in its suffering, but also in its joy and in its optimism. So God bless you in the name of the 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. And I'll see you all very soon. All right. Have a good day now. Good weekend to all.